I still cannot believe she looked at the situation and chose an HOA rule over basic common sense. That thought stayed with me for months, but on the day it happened, I was too shocked to fully understand what I had just witnessed. My name is Ethan Walker, and until that afternoon, I had never been involved in any serious conflict with our HOA. I lived in Oak Valley Estates for nearly 6 years. I paid my dues, followed community guidelines, and generally avoided neighborhood politics. Like many homeowners, I viewed HOA meetings as something to tolerate rather than enjoy. That changed because of a decision made by HOA President Brenda Collins. The situation began on a warm Saturday afternoon near one of the private access gates serving our section of the neighborhood. Residents had gathered nearby for a community event, and the atmosphere was relaxed. Families were outside. Neighbors were talking. Everything felt normal. Then a situation developed that required immediate attention from emergency responders. People became concerned. Residents started making calls. What should have been a straightforward process suddenly became something else entirely. The problem centered on access. Oak Valley Estates had several controlled entry points designed to limit traffic into the community. Under normal circumstances, the system worked fine. On that day, however, normal circumstances no longer existed. Several residents believed the fastest solution was obvious. Open the access point and remove any unnecessary delays. Instead, the conversation became tangled in HOA procedures. Brenda arrived quickly and immediately took control of the discussion. At first, many people seemed relieved. As HOA president, she often projected confidence during community issues. But within minutes, the mood changed. Residents began suggesting practical solutions. Brenda responded by referencing HOA requirements. Someone pointed out that the situation was unusual. Brenda responded with another rule. Someone else questioned whether flexibility might be appropriate. Brenda cited policy language again. The exchange became increasingly frustrating. What shocked me most was not that she cared about the rules. It was that she appeared to care about them more than the circumstances unfolding around her. Several neighbors exchanged confused looks. Others remained silent. Nobody seemed eager to challenge the HOA president publicly. Then I watched something that immediately bothered me. Brenda spoke with absolute certainty, as though the discussion was already settled. She acted as if questioning the procedure itself was unreasonable. The confidence influenced people. Residents who initially expressed concerns began backing away from the conversation. Before long, the debate shifted. Instead of discussing whether the policy made sense, people started discussing whether anyone should question the policy at all. That subtle change altered everything. By the end of the afternoon, the original concern had almost disappeared from the conversation. Brenda had successfully reframed the issue. The focus was no longer on the delay or the decision. The focus became compliance. As neighbors headed home, I noticed something strange. Brenda seemed unusually pleased with how events unfolded. She spoke with several residents and appeared completely convinced that she had handled the situation correctly. Meanwhile, others looked uncertain. Some homeowners quietly questioned what happened. Others avoided discussing it altogether. Driving home later that evening, I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not just with the decision itself, but with how quickly everyone accepted it. At the time, I thought the controversy would fade within a few days. I had no idea that what happened at that gate was about to divide the entire neighborhood and start a chain of events that would eventually change Oak Valley Estates forever. By the middle of the following week, it became obvious that the neighborhood had already chosen a side. Unfortunately, it was not mine. What surprised me most was how quickly public opinion formed. Very few residents seemed interested in discussing the details of what actually happened. Instead, they focused on Brenda's explanation. According to the version spreading throughout Oak Valley Estates, the HOA president had simply followed established procedures during a difficult situation. The story sounded reasonable enough that many homeowners accepted it without question. The more often it was repeated, the more permanent it became. Then the rumors started. At first they were small. A neighbor mentioned that some residents believed I was exaggerating the problem. Another suggested people thought I was looking for reasons to criticize the HOA. Within days, the narrative expanded. Somehow, I had become the homeowner who wanted to create conflict where none existed. The transformation happened so quickly that it almost felt coordinated. What frustrated me was that many of the people repeating those stories had not even been present when the event occurred. Yet they spoke with remarkable confidence. Meanwhile, Brenda appeared more comfortable than ever. Several residents told me they had spoken with her directly. In every conversation, she seemed prepared with the same explanation. She emphasized procedures. She emphasized consistency. Most importantly, she emphasized the importance of following the rules. The message was simple and effective. If the rules existed, then following them must have been the correct decision. Many homeowners accepted that logic immediately. Then something happened that made the situation even stranger. During a casual conversation near the community mailboxes, I overheard two neighbors discussing the incident. One resident admitted that he initially questioned Brenda's decision. The other responded by saying there was probably information the HOA president knew that ordinary residents did not. That assumption appeared repeatedly throughout the neighborhood. People were giving Brenda the benefit of the doubt because they assumed authority came with knowledge. The problem was that nobody could explain what that knowledge actually was. A few days later, Michael Turner stopped by my house. Michael had been present near the gate on the day everything happened. He looked frustrated. According to him, the story spreading through the neighborhood barely resembled what he remembered. Several key details were either missing or completely changed. More importantly, nobody seemed interested in hearing corrections. Residents preferred the simpler version. Brenda followed the rules. End of discussion. Michael's comments confirmed what I had already suspected. The controversy was no longer about facts. It was about perception. Then came another unexpected development. The HOA released a community newsletter. Most of the document covered routine topics, but one section focused on the importance of respecting established procedures. No names were mentioned. No specific incident was referenced. Yet nearly every resident understood the message. The implication was impossible to miss. The HOA was reinforcing the same narrative that had already spread throughout the neighborhood. Brenda was not simply defending a decision. She was shaping how people interpreted it. By the end of the week, I noticed a significant emotional shift among residents. People who originally expressed uncertainty now sounded confident. Homeowners who asked questions earlier were suddenly repeating HOA talking points. The transformation fascinated me because almost nothing new had been learned. The facts remained exactly the same. Yet public opinion had moved dramatically. That realization stayed with me. Because if the neighborhood could reach such strong conclusions without new information, I began wondering what might happen if new information ever appeared. Over the next several weeks, I discovered how quickly a community can rewrite a story when the wrong narrative gains momentum. What began as a disagreement about a decision slowly transformed into something much larger. In the eyes of many residents, I was no longer a homeowner asking reasonable questions. I had become the person challenging the HOA. That distinction mattered because once people assign someone a role, they often start interpreting everything through that lens. If I asked a question, it was seen as criticism. If I remained silent, it was seen as resentment. There seemed to be no way to escape the story that had been created around me. Then something unexpected happened. A handful of residents started approaching me privately. None of them wanted public attention. Most specifically asked me not to mention their names. Yet they all expressed similar concerns. They were not necessarily agreeing with me. They simply felt uncomfortable with how quickly the neighborhood reached conclusions. One homeowner admitted that she originally supported Brenda's decision, but could not explain why. Another said the more she thought about the situation, the more she realized everyone was discussing opinions instead of facts. Those conversations gave me my first indication that the narrative might not be as stable as it appeared. Then Michael Turner shared an observation that immediately caught my attention. During separate conversations with different neighbors, he noticed a strange inconsistency. Residents often repeated the same conclusions, but they rarely agreed on the details that supposedly supported those conclusions. One person remembered events unfolding one way. Another described them differently. A third version contradicted both. Yet all three people somehow arrived at the same judgment. The contradiction was impossible to ignore once Michael pointed it out. If the facts varied so dramatically, why did the conclusions remain identical? A few days later, I attended a small neighborhood gathering near the clubhouse. Most conversations were casual until someone mentioned the gate incident. The mood changed immediately. Several residents began discussing what happened. At first, the conversation followed the familiar pattern. Brenda followed the rules. The HOA acted appropriately. End of discussion. Then an older homeowner named Linda Carter asked a simple question. She wanted to know exactly which rule required the decision that had been made. The group became noticeably quieter. People exchanged looks. Nobody seemed certain. Some thought they knew. Others guessed. No one could provide a clear answer. That moment lasted less than a minute, but it changed the entire conversation. For the first time, I watched residents realize that confidence and knowledge are not the same thing. Then another surprise emerged. Linda later told me she had reviewed several HOA documents herself and found the relevant policies more complicated than people claimed. She was not accusing anyone of wrongdoing. She was simply pointing out that the issue was not nearly as straightforward as residents had been led to believe. Her comments spread quickly. By the end of the week, more homeowners were discussing policy language than neighborhood rumors. That shift might sound small, but it represented a major change. The community was beginning to examine the foundation of the narrative rather than the narrative itself. Meanwhile, Brenda appeared increasingly determined to reinforce her position. Community updates became more frequent. Explanations became more polished. Discussions became more carefully managed. The harder she worked to control the conversation, the more some residents started wondering why control was necessary in the first place. And for the first time since this controversy began, that question was spreading faster than the rumors ever did. The more residents examined the details, the more uncomfortable the situation became for HOA leadership. What originally looked like a simple dispute was slowly turning into a discussion about interpretation, authority, and accountability. That shift created tension throughout Oak Valley Estates. Homeowners who once accepted the official explanation without hesitation were now comparing notes and reviewing documents for themselves. The change was gradual, but it was impossible to miss. Then the HOA announced a community meeting. Officially, the agenda focused on neighborhood projects and future improvements. Unofficially, everyone knew residents would bring up the controversy. Interest in the meeting spread quickly. People who rarely attended HOA events suddenly planned to be there. The atmosphere leading up to the meeting felt different from anything I had experienced in the neighborhood before. Conversations were no longer centered on personalities. They were centered on questions. The evening finally arrived, and the clubhouse filled faster than usual. Every chair was occupied. Several residents stood along the walls. Brenda opened the meeting with her typical confidence. She discussed budgets, maintenance schedules, and landscaping plans. Everything seemed routine on the surface, yet everyone could feel the tension underneath. Eventually, the conversation moved to community communication. That was when the questions started. At first, they were polite. Residents asked about transparency. They asked about policy interpretation. Brenda answered comfortably. Then the questions became more specific. Linda Carter asked whether homeowners could review the exact policies referenced during the original decision. The request sounded simple. The reaction was not. Brenda immediately shifted into a lengthy explanation about board responsibilities and administrative procedures. Several residents exchanged confused looks. The answer seemed much longer than the question required. Then Michael Turner stood up. He calmly explained that many residents were hearing different versions of the same event and wanted clarification. Once again, Brenda responded without directly addressing the concern. Instead, she emphasized trust in HOA leadership. That response created an unexpected effect. Rather than reassuring people, It seemed to increase their curiosity. The room grew noticeably quieter. Then came the moment that changed everything. A resident named Sarah Bennett asked whether anyone had reviewed how the relevant policies were actually applied during the situation. The question hung in the air. It was not an accusation. It was simply a request for clarity. Yet Brenda appeared visibly irritated. For the first time that evening, her confidence seemed strained. She responded by suggesting that continued debate served no useful purpose and that the community should focus on moving forward. The reaction inside the room was immediate. Several homeowners looked surprised. Others looked frustrated. One resident quietly pointed out that unresolved questions do not disappear simply because people stop talking about them. That comment triggered a wave of agreement throughout the clubhouse. Then another unexpected detail emerged. During the discussion, multiple residents admitted they still had not seen the specific documentation supporting the narrative that had circulated for weeks. The realization spread rapidly. People had accepted conclusions without reviewing the underlying information themselves. Suddenly, the controversy looked very different. By the time the meeting ended, the atmosphere had changed completely. Brenda entered the evening expecting to reinforce her position. Instead, she left facing more questions than ever. As residents gathered in the parking lot afterward, conversations continued long into the night. Then I overheard something that immediately caught my attention. A homeowner mentioned that a local attorney might be willing to review the situation from an outside perspective. The comment lasted only a few seconds before the conversation moved on. But unlike most rumors spreading through the neighborhood, this one felt different. Because for the first time, the discussion was about more than opinions. It was about whether someone independent might examine the entire story. The week after the meeting should have eased tensions inside Oak Valley Estates. Instead, the opposite happened. Residents left the clubhouse with more questions than answers, and those questions spread throughout the neighborhood faster than any official HOA communication. Everywhere I went, people discussed the same issue. Why was it so difficult to get direct answers? The more homeowners talked, the more obvious the problem became. The controversy was no longer fading. It was growing. Brenda appeared to recognize the danger immediately. Within days, several new community announcements appeared. Homeowners received updates about future projects, volunteer opportunities, and upcoming events. The neighborhood suddenly seemed flooded with positive initiatives. On the surface, nothing about those communications seemed unusual. Yet many residents interpreted them differently. To some, it looked like an effort to redirect attention. The timing felt too convenient. Then another community meeting was announced with surprisingly little notice. The stated purpose focused on improving communication between residents and HOA leadership. The irony was impossible to ignore. People arrived expecting discussion. Instead, they found something very different. Brenda opened the meeting by emphasizing unity and cooperation. She spoke at length about avoiding division and maintaining a positive atmosphere. The message sounded reasonable. The problem was that it did not address the questions residents were asking. Every time someone tried to revisit the controversy, the conversation was redirected toward broader community goals. Several homeowners noticed the pattern almost immediately. Then came a moment that changed the tone of the entire meeting. Linda Carter politely asked whether the HOA board would provide additional documentation related to the policy interpretations that had become the center of discussion. The room became quiet. Brenda responded by explaining that the matter had already been reviewed internally and that further debate would not benefit the community. Her answer surprised many residents. Instead of creating closure, it created suspicion. Homeowners who had remained neutral suddenly looked uncomfortable. Then Michael Turner stood up and asked a simple question. If the issue had been fully reviewed, why were so many residents still struggling to understand the reasoning behind the decision? Once again, no direct answer came. Instead, the discussion shifted toward respecting board authority. That was the moment everything changed. For months, references to authority had successfully ended conversations. This time they did not. Several residents openly pushed back. Not aggressively, not emotionally. They simply wanted explanations. The fact that such ordinary questions seemed unwelcome became a story of its own. As the meeting continued, the mood inside the clubhouse grew increasingly tense. Brenda appeared frustrated. Residents appeared unconvinced. Every attempt to close the discussion seemed to generate two new questions. Then something happened that nobody expected. After the meeting ended, a resident introduced me to Rachel Bennett, a local attorney who happened to live in a nearby community. Rachel had heard about the controversy through mutual acquaintances. She was careful not to offer legal opinions on the spot. Instead, she asked one question that immediately caught my attention. She wanted to know whether anyone had ever reviewed the situation from the perspective of responsibility rather than policy. The question sounded simple, yet nobody had framed the issue that way before. For weeks, residents argued about rules. Rachel was asking about consequences. The distinction changed everything. Driving home that evening, I could not stop thinking about her question. The entire neighborhood had been trapped inside a debate over procedures. What if the real issue was not the rule itself? What if the issue was the decision to rely on that rule under those specific circumstances? For the first time since the controversy began, I felt like someone had identified the question nobody else had been asking, and I had a feeling the answer was going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. Rachel Bennett agreed to meet with me a few days later at a small office near downtown. I arrived expecting a discussion about HOA regulations. Instead, she spent most of the meeting asking questions about timelines, decisions, communications, and responsibilities. The conversation felt completely different from every neighborhood debate I had experienced. Residents focused on personalities. Rachel focused on process. Residents argued about whether Brenda followed the rules. Rachel wanted to know whether relying on those rules was appropriate under the circumstances. That distinction immediately changed how I viewed the entire situation. As I explained everything that happened, Rachel listened carefully and took notes. Occasionally, she stopped me to clarify a detail. She asked who made certain decisions. She asked when those decisions were made. Most importantly, she asked what alternatives were available at the time. No one in the neighborhood had ever focused on alternatives. Discussions always centered on what Brenda did. Rachel wanted to know what Brenda could have done. The difference was enormous. Then she asked a question that stayed with me long after the meeting ended. She wanted to know whether the community had become so focused on compliance that it stopped evaluating judgment. For several seconds, I did not know how to answer. The more I thought about it, the more accurate the observation seemed. Throughout the controversy, residents repeatedly defended the decision by pointing to HOA procedures. Very few people examined whether those procedures were applied wisely. Suddenly, the entire argument looked different. Then Rachel explained something that surprised me. In many disputes, the existence of a rule is not the end of the conversation. Context matters. Decision-making matters. Reasonableness matters. She was careful not to reach conclusions before reviewing more information, but her perspective introduced an entirely new way of understanding what happened. For the first time, I felt like someone was examining the situation from outside the neighborhood narrative. Then came another unexpected development. Word somehow spread that I had spoken with an attorney. I never announced it. Rachel never discussed it. Yet within days, several residents seemed aware of the meeting. The reaction throughout Oak Valley Estates was immediate. Some homeowners became curious. Others became nervous. A few openly questioned why legal perspectives were entering what they viewed as a community disagreement. The conversations revealed something important. People were starting to recognize that the controversy might extend beyond neighborhood politics. Meanwhile, Brenda appeared increasingly determined to project confidence. Community communications continued. Explanations continued. Reassurances continued. Yet something had changed. Residents no longer accepted those messages as easily as before. Questions followed every update. Discussions continued after every announcement. The certainty that once protected the official narrative was beginning to fade. Then Rachel contacted me with another observation. After reviewing publicly available information and the sequence of events I described, she believed the timeline itself deserved closer examination. Not because it automatically proved anything, but but because timelines often reveal inconsistencies that people overlook when focusing on emotions and opinions. Her comment immediately caught my attention. For months, the neighborhood had debated motives, intentions, and authority. Very few residents had carefully examined the order in which events occurred. That realization created a new sense of anticipation. Because timelines are different from opinions, they either fit together logically or they do not. And if the timeline surrounding this controversy contained gaps, contradictions, or unanswered questions, the entire foundation of the story could begin to shift. For the first time since everything started, I sensed that the narrative controlling Oak Valley Estates might be approaching a serious problem. Not because anyone was making accusations, because someone was finally asking the right questions. Once Rachel shifted her attention toward the timeline, the entire controversy started looking different. What had previously appeared to be a simple sequence of events suddenly became a series of questions that nobody had properly answered. Residents throughout Oak Valley Estates were still debating opinions, but a smaller group had started examining something more concrete. They were comparing dates, conversations, meeting notes, community messages, and personal recollections. The goal was not to prove anyone right or wrong. The goal was to understand how the narrative developed so quickly and why it spread with such certainty. Then the first major inconsistency appeared. Michael Turner called me one evening after speaking with several homeowners who attended the original gathering. According to their recollections, some conclusions seemed to circulate throughout the neighborhood almost immediately. The problem was that those conclusions appeared before many residents had enough information to reasonably reach them. At first, that detail sounded insignificant. The more people discussed it, however, the more important it became. If strong conclusions emerged before complete information was available, where did those conclusions come from? The question spread rapidly among residents who were already skeptical. Then another inconsistency surfaced. Linda Carter had been reviewing community communications from the weeks following the incident. She noticed that certain explanations remained remarkably consistent across multiple conversations and messages. Normally, that would not be unusual. What caught her attention was the speed. The same narrative seemed to appear everywhere almost at once. Linda was not accusing anyone of coordinating information. She simply found the pattern difficult to explain. Her observation added another layer of uncertainty. Then came a meeting that nobody expected to matter. A small group of residents gathered informally at a local coffee shop to discuss neighborhood concerns. There was no official agenda, no HOA involvement, just homeowners comparing experiences. During that discussion, several people independently described the same frustration. Every time they asked specific questions about timing, the conversation somehow returned to general statements about policy and authority. The pattern was so consistent that once it was mentioned, everyone noticed it. That realization created a visible shift in the room. Residents were beginning to understand that some questions received answers while others received redirection. Then Rachel shared another insight. She explained that timelines often become important because they remove emotion from a dispute. People can disagree about intentions. They can disagree about motivations. They cannot easily disagree about when events occurred. Her comment resonated throughout the neighborhood. More homeowners started focusing on chronology rather than personality. The effect was immediate. Conversations became more precise. Questions became more detailed. Assumptions became harder to maintain. Meanwhile, Brenda appeared increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of those discussions. Community updates continued emphasizing unity and moving forward. Yet residents seemed less interested in moving forward than understanding what happened. Every attempt to close the conversation appeared to generate even more curiosity. Then came the development that truly changed everything. Rachel informed me that after reviewing the available information, she believed the situation deserved a more formal examination. She was careful with her wording. She did not promise outcomes. She did not make accusations. She simply believed that the facts should be evaluated through an official process rather than neighborhood speculation. The recommendation immediately elevated the stakes. For months, The controversy existed almost entirely inside Oak Valley Estates. Now it was moving beyond community politics. News of that possibility spread faster than anything else had. Some residents were excited. Others were worried. Brenda remained publicly confident, but even her supporters seemed less certain than before. The neighborhood had reached a point where opinions no longer felt sufficient. People wanted answers supported by something stronger. And for the first time since the original incident, it looked like those answers might actually be coming. The moment the situation moved into a formal review process, the atmosphere inside Oak Valley Estates changed overnight. For months, residents had relied on assumptions, personal opinions, and competing narratives. Now, an independent evaluation was examining the facts themselves. The shift created anticipation throughout the neighborhood. Homeowners who once dismissed the controversy suddenly paid close attention. Others who had defended Brenda with absolute confidence became noticeably quieter. Everyone seemed to understand that objective findings would soon replace speculation. Then the waiting began. Weeks passed with very little public information. During that period, something unexpected happened. The absence of new developments forced residents to revisit old conversations. Without fresh rumors to discuss, people started reflecting on what they actually knew versus what they assumed. That distinction became increasingly important. Several homeowners admitted they had accepted the official narrative largely because it came from HOA leadership. Others acknowledged they never reviewed the policies themselves. The community was slowly confronting an uncomfortable reality. Confidence had often been mistaken for accuracy. Then the findings finally arrived. The details were not released through dramatic announcements or emotional confrontations. Instead, they emerged through a careful review of records, communications, timelines, and decision-making processes. What made the conclusions so powerful was their simplicity. They focused on facts rather than personalities. And those facts immediately challenged assumptions that had dominated the neighborhood for months. The most significant finding involved the decision-making process itself. The review determined that multiple options were available during the situation at the gate. That conclusion alone changed everything. For months, residents were led to believe the outcome was unavoidable because the rules required it. The review showed that alternatives existed. Suddenly, the entire conversation shifted. The issue was no longer whether Brenda followed a rule. The issue became why she chose one option over others. That distinction completely altered public perception. Then came another major revelation. The timeline analysis raised serious questions about how quickly certain conclusions spread throughout the neighborhood. While the review did not accuse anyone of intentionally misleading residents, it established that many assumptions gained traction long before all relevant information was available. Homeowners immediately recognized the significance. The narrative that shaped public opinion had developed before the facts were fully understood. That realization spread through Oak Valley Estates faster than any rumor ever had. Then came the true turning point. The review concluded that several concerns raised by residents were reasonable and deserved meaningful consideration from the beginning. That statement carried enormous weight. For months, people who asked questions were portrayed as creating unnecessary conflict. Now, an independent examination validated the importance of those questions. The reversal was stunning. Residents who once avoided discussing the issue openly were suddenly sharing the findings with neighbors throughout the community. Meanwhile, Brenda attempted to defend her actions by emphasizing good intentions and procedural consistency. The problem was that the discussion had moved beyond intentions. Residents were comparing her explanations to documented findings. For the first time since the controversy began, her authority no longer controlled the narrative. Facts did. The impact on the neighborhood was immediate. Conversations changed. Opinions shifted. Longtime supporters started expressing doubts. Neutral residents began demanding greater transparency. Even board members appeared more cautious during public discussions. By the end of the week, it was clear that the review had accomplished something nobody thought possible months earlier. It had united residents around a common set of facts. The story that once depended on authority and repetition was beginning to collapse under the weight of independent findings. And as homeowners processed what they had learned, one question started appearing everywhere. If the facts were this different from the narrative, what consequences would follow next? The consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, which somehow made them even more powerful. In the days following the review, residents throughout Oak Valley Estates continued discussing the findings. What surprised me most was how many homeowners were willing to admit they had changed their minds. People who once defended Brenda without hesitation now openly acknowledged that they had relied too heavily on assumptions. Others admitted they trusted the authority of the HOA more than the facts available at the time. Those conversations were not hostile. They were reflective. The community was learning an important lesson about how easily narratives can form when questions are discouraged. Then the HOA board held another public meeting. Attendance reached levels nobody could remember seeing before. Residents filled the clubhouse and lined the walls. The atmosphere felt completely different from earlier meetings. Months ago, questions were treated as obstacles. Now they were expected. Homeowners arrived prepared. They wanted transparency, explanations, and reforms that would prevent similar situations in the future. Brenda entered the meeting with the same confidence she had displayed throughout the controversy, but the room responded differently. People listened respectfully, yet they no longer accepted statements without scrutiny. Every important claim generated follow-up questions. Every explanation was measured against documented findings. The authority that once protected her position had weakened dramatically. Then came the defining moment. Several residents proposed changes to community procedures, including clearer emergency access guidelines, greater transparency in decision-making, and stronger communication standards. The proposals received broad support. What made the moment remarkable was not the content of the reforms. It was the reason they existed. The community was acknowledging that the old approach had failed. The rules Brenda once relied upon so heavily were now being rewritten because residents no longer trusted them to function without accountability. The irony was impossible to ignore. The very policies that helped protect her narrative had become the catalyst for change. Over the following months, additional improvements were adopted. Meeting records became easier to access. Policy discussions became more open. Residents became more engaged. Questions that once caused discomfort became a normal part of community governance. The culture of Oak Valley Estates slowly transformed. People were no longer satisfied with simple assurances. They wanted clarity. They wanted documentation. Most importantly, they wanted leadership that welcomed scrutiny rather than avoided it. As for Brenda, she remained in the neighborhood, but her influence never fully recovered. Residents treated her politely, yet the unquestioned trust she once enjoyed was gone. Every decision faced examination. Every explanation required support. The authority she spent years building had not disappeared overnight, but it had undeniably changed. Meanwhile, the legal process that initially seemed intimidating ended up revealing something much larger than a dispute over one decision. It exposed how communities can drift away from accountability when people stop asking questions. Looking back now, I realize the most important outcome was not the review itself. It was what happened afterward. The neighborhood became stronger because residents learned to value facts over assumptions. They learned that authority should be respected, but not blindly accepted. They learned that transparency benefits everyone. Sometimes I still drive past that access gate and think about how this entire story began. At the time, it looked like a simple disagreement over a rule. In reality, it became a lesson about judgment, responsibility, and the consequences of placing procedure above common sense. Brenda believed the rules would protect her decision forever. Instead, those same rules attracted the scrutiny that ultimately changed everything. And in the end, the outcome was not defined by the loudest voice, the most powerful position, or the most confident explanation. It was defined by facts, accountability, and a community that finally decided to demand both.